Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon, and today is Thursday. It's February 27th of 2025. Today is day 510 since October 7th of 2023. This is the weekly update, which is a little bit longer. It summarizes the news from the past week, and I'd encourage you to use this news as prayer, use it as a way to be informed, but as Dr. Ma'adi of Passia would say in Jerusalem, if the truth is not spoken, the truth would be lost. And so might we use it as a way of giving witness to the lives that are lost, giving witness to the lives that are being lived, to advocate for peace and for justice, speaking truth about what's happening throughout the Middle East, wherever it may be, from Syria to Lebanon, to Israel, to Jordan, to Palestine, including the occupied Palestinian territories, and especially in Gaza. So ceasefire or no ceasefire, these updates, I wrote them this morning. So of course, news changes by the hour, but there's a great question of whether or not the war is going to begin in Gaza. And if you think that a ceasefire means that there is not continuing to be daily death, I just wish that were not the case. War is abounding today in the occupied West Bank and has been for the past several days. And so that's part of what I'll be talking about in terms of the weekly summary. On Saturday, Israel withheld the delay and release of 620 Palestinian prisoners. They were planned for last Saturday. This was in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners, 620, in exchange for 6 hostages a week ago. And the Palestinian prisoners were not released. They were held because of the methodology by which the hostages were released. And so it was agreed that those Palestinian prisoners, would be released at a later time. And so there was a big question about what would happen. So that all happened this week. And then Hamas just in the past day or so said the only way for Israel to secure the release of the remaining hostages, of which there are 30 or so that are believed to be alive, is through a commitment to a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire. So they said that in an official statement on Thursday. They said that they're fully committed to the ceasefire agreement in Gaza. They said that they are committed to moving on to phase 2. Phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement is completely ended, and phase 2 was supposed to begin negotiations several weeks ago, and as of yet, they have not begun. Hamas said the only way for Israel to secure the release of remaining hostages is through the implementation of the next stages of the deal. Today, there were bodies returned to Israel, 4 bodies of slain Israeli hostages. They were then sent for forensic identification to determine whether or not they were the bodies that were supposed to have been released. They were given police and military escort and sent to the Institute for Forensic Medicine in Tel Aviv. On Wednesday afternoon, yesterday, the announcement that phase 1 was complete, and that had included the agreement that the Israel-Hamas ceasefire was set, phase 1 was set to end. All of that happened yesterday afternoon. There was another whole dispute about the Philadelphia corridor, and the Philadelphia corridor is, that area between Gaza and Egypt, that border. Israel had a written commitment as a part of the ceasefire agreement that they would withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor. They're supposed to do that by next Saturday, and there's a question of whether or not that will happen, and that whether or not there will be a complete evacuation within the next 8 days. President Donald Trump said yesterday, Wednesday evening in Washington, that he's determined to move forward with the ceasefire deal. He said stage 1 has ended, stage 2 has started. Steve Witkoff is supposed to be on the way to the Middle East. He's the Middle East envoy. He could be on his way there any day now, but part of the thought was that he might be there by Sunday to bring a conclusion, or further negotiations. It was said that he believed Israel and Hamas would reach understandings on the way forward as early as this weekend. He indicated, he might get there Sunday to close the deal. Despite countless bumps, the humanitarian operation is fully complete, and all 33 of the hostages that were set to be released in phase 1 were released, and 1,135 Palestinian prisoners have been released. Trump said in a cabinet meeting that it is up to Israel to decide the next move. Prisoners were released. So these were of the 600 prisoners that remained, 97 Palestinian prisoners. So that prisoner exchange began today. 97 Palestinian prisoners were handed over to Egypt, according to sources. And at the time of this writing, Israel had transferred an additional 43 Palestinian prisoners from Ofer prison to the Red Cross. And so it's believed that those 600 Palestinian prisoners that were supposed to be released last Saturday have finally started to be released. Moving on to Israel, the Israeli army presented its investigation of the October 7th attack, and specifically the battle for Kibbutz Kfar Aza. The kibbutz acknowledged that the report was thorough, but they said it did not answer the crucial question of where was the IDF? According to the probe, 250 militants captured the kibbutz, and the IDF soldiers did not enter until 8:30. What I heard when I was on the ground in the kibbutzim and the Gaza enclave is that it took more than 8 hours for the IDF to show up. There were only 14 members in that kibbutz on the emergency squad. They fought alone, and 37 kibbutz members by that time had been killed. Israel is set to release a delayed customs clearing money that was owed to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority has been waiting for 3 weeks for this money. This is tax money or clearance money that's been collected that it's owed to the Palestinian Authority. Employees for the PA are set to receive their salaries March 1st, which is the first day of Ramadan. Israel is set to announce that the finance minister Smotrich is visiting the United States. I don't know that we've heard that in U.S. media. He's supposed to have an official visit next week to visit his counterpart in Washington. And a 20-year-old resident in the central Israeli Arab city of Taibe, who published social media posts in praise of the October 7th attacks, was sentenced to 27 months in prison for incitement to terrorism. Israel denied the entry of the European Parliament member Rima Hassan into the country in accordance with the recommendation of the Diaspora Affairs and Combating Anti-Semitism Ministry Department. Israeli security forces have been searching the area near the Jordan border this week to rule out whether or not there has been a possible infiltration, which has been a big question as there are possible escalations, throughout the region. And Foreign Minister Gideon Sahar told EU foreign ministers at an association council meeting that included 20 different countries this past week that our relations will not be held hostage by the bitter conflict with our Palestinian neighbors. He said that 80 years after the Holocaust, there's a huge wave of anti-Semitism on European soil and that Europe has to deal with this. This is pretty significant. Almost a week ago, last Friday, 3 empty buses exploded in Tel Aviv in Israel. Hamas published a statement and attributed the attack to the Tulkarm battalion, who claimed responsibility. While there were no injuries, it was believed that the attack was supposed to happen during kind of rush hour. There were also other bombs that were not detonated because security forces got to them prior to detonation. 2 Israelis were arrested on suspicion of being involved in those explosions. And the Israeli military, in large part about a week ago, said that they were deploying 3 battalions to the West Bank because of those explosions. In Gaza over the weekend, the polio vaccination campaign resumed, according to the World Health Organization. And earlier this week, one report indicated that over a 24-hour period, even though there's a ceasefire, at least 3 Palestinians were killed and 11 were injured by Israeli attacks across Gaza, just within the period of a day. Israel did start to allow the entry of mobile homes for displaced Palestinians into Gaza. That was one of the complaints by Hamas, that there was a delay of the delivery. And aid workers and medics said that they feared that Palestinians who were leaving Gaza because of medical treatment would not be given the right to return once they left. Hamas has said that they would not disarm and that they would regroup in Gaza, according to a spokesperson. One spokesperson said that they were not clinging to power, but then others said that they would not disarm. Earlier this week, the Israeli Defense Forces raised their readiness along the Gaza border, which is ending civilian restrictions in the north. So while Palestinian residents are returning to their homes in the north of Gaza, Israeli soldiers are literally lining up on the border ready to go back to war. And so part of what we're hearing from our contacts on the Gaza Strip is that they fear that bombs are going to start dropping any day now, and that what happens now that phase one of the ceasefire has come to an end. This past week, there were 6 newborn babies who died of hypothermia in makeshift shelters in Gaza. And Egypt has rejected a proposal to displace the Palestinian people and has said that they will not liquidate the Palestinian cause and avoid threatening regional and national security. They said that in advance of an emergency Arab League summit that's taking place on March 4th. There was a lot of discussion this week in the press, particularly in Arab press. A leading Hamas official named Musa Abu Marzouk, the New York Times wrote about this. Marzouk said he opposed the October 7th attacks, but then a few days later, he came out and said that those comments were taken completely out of context and that he ardently believes in the Palestinian people's right to resistance in all of its forms. And he later, talked about violence as a possibility in that regard. The IDF on Sunday reported that they conducted an airstrike in central Gaza against suspicious vehicles that were driving north. They were not on the right road, apparently. 2 Palestinian policemen were killed and another was wounded in an Israeli strike on Rafah this past week. And that's all just in Gaza. Now, let me talk about the West Bank. The West Bank is going up in flames. A week ago Friday, things escalated so significantly. A 13-year-old Palestinian was killed by military fire, Israeli military. This was in Jenin. The teenager's name was Rias Amori. Netanyahu visited the Tulkarm refugee camp in the West Bank. This is unheard of for an Israeli prime minister to do this. I mean, this is unheard of. He went to the West Bank, where a military operation was happening. He ordered more troops and operations, and he said, we're entering the strongholds of terrorism, flattening entire streets, and eliminating terrorists. I just want you to know there have been 40,000 Palestinians displaced since the beginning of this year, and it has not even been, this is the last day of February. 40,000 Palestinians, the largest number of Palestinians displaced since 1967. Just for the record, that was before I was born, to let you know how long that's been. By Saturday, Israeli forces have set up hundreds of checkpoints across the occupied West Bank. They started their offensive on January 21st, Since January 21st, at least 70 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces during that time. 70 Palestinians. There also has been widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure in local communities. There's fear that all-out war has begun and Israel is besieging the northern West Bank. Israeli tanks have been seen in the West Bank for the first time in 20 years, particularly in the northern territories, Jenin, the refugee camp, where tens of thousands of Palestinians have been displaced. A Nablus resident was killed on Tuesday. Several others were wounded with confrontations with Israeli forces. On Sunday morning this past week, it was announced by private security channels that there were West Bank attacks by settlers. Settlers stole 800 sheep and water tankers from the town of Deir Dabwan, and they attacked Palestinian Bedouin communities in the Jabba town east of Jerusalem. Israeli forces expelled residents of the occupied West Banks, Jenin, Tulkarm, and Ner Sham's refugee camps. And the defense minister of Israel said the empty camps. What does empty mean? That is a sign for ethnic cleansing. The empty camps would be occupied by the Israeli military for the coming year to prevent the return of residents and the resurgence of terrorism. To prevent the return of residents, I just want you to know, literally, the population of different segments of the West Bank are being completely displaced and not allowed to return. On Monday, I got this from on-the-ground reports that in Tulkarm, nearly 100 houses were destroyed. Israeli forces arrested 2 Palestinian suspects in an attack that wounded 2 Israelis near the West Bank town of Deir Dabwan, and 6 suspects in Jenin were arrested and weapons were seized. Some West Bank workers who did not have permits to be able to work in Israel were deported this past week. And there was a question about whether or not this news was fake news. Israeli officials said that it was, but I just wanted to share it with you because it was reported. If it was said that these West Bank workers who did not have permits, it was said that they were deported back to Gaza, not the West Bank. These were people whose families and homes were in the West Bank. Now, if they were deported to Gaza, it means they would not be allowed to return back home. And so that was in the news this week as well. 40 right-wing activists, 125 border guards, 12 members of Israeli intelligence stormed the courtyards of the Al-Aqsa compound mosque this morning during morning incursions. In Jerusalem, this week I sent a letter to Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, about the situation in the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem. The Armenian Patriarchate is under the threat that its lands could be confiscated as a part of a foreclosure by the Jerusalem municipality. We've launched a campaign against this, and we'd encourage you to get involved. We want to let people know that Christians in the holy city of Jerusalem are under threat, certainly in the Armenian quarter, but not only. The very Christian community is in peril. We call this, Jerusalem, the city of peace, where religious freedom should exist for Jews, Christians, and Muslims who worship together side by side. And so we're calling for intervention, that this is a threat to Christians in Jerusalem, but to Christians and people of any religious belief in the Holy Land or anywhere around the world. As I've said, there's been active warfare happening in the West Bank, the worst so as in the past 20 years. This past week, I highlighted many of the incidents that happened throughout the West Bank. I won't go through those again, but if you'd like the details, listen to my daily updates of in past days, talking about Nablus and Jenin and Hebron and the Ner Shams refugee camp. The devastation, I just want you to know the situation there, it's the worst that it's been for many of the contacts we know and the friends and, the people in our networks. The situation is just horrific on the ground. In Lebanon, the IDF conducted airstrikes and targeted cross points at the Lebanese-Syrian border, saying that Hezbollah was attempting to smuggle weapons this past week. Earlier this week, tens of thousands of mourners gathered at the funeral of Hezbollah. Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, who was killed in an Israeli airstrike about 5 months ago. It was said that 1.4 million people attended his ceremony. During the ceremony, Israeli airstrikes struck numerous locations all over Lebanon, according to reports, including Baalbek, Wadi Zbin, Jantana. I won't go through all of the locations. And in Beirut, there were flyovers by the Israeli military that flew very low, which can be quite intimidating and threatening. And I did not hear whether or not they broke the sound barrier, but if you have heard that, which I know has happened numerous times by the Israeli military over Beirut in past weeks, it literally sounds like a bomb exploding. In recent days, the IDF said it killed a Hezbollah operative responsible for arms smuggling in a strike in Lebanon. The army said the operative had violated the Israeli-Lebanese ceasefire because it was involved in weapons transfers. A few updates about Syria. Late Tuesday night, there were Israeli airstrikes around the south of Damascus. Israel struck military targets in South Syria on Tuesday. Defense Minister Katz said that there's a new policy of demilitarizing Syria, and it's according to the Israelis, they say it needs to be done, and so, it must be done. And so Israel called for the demilitarization of Syria, and so they're enacting it by airstrikes, which, just for the record, that's completely illegal by international law. Hundreds of participants attended the long-awaited National Dialogue Conference that was in Damascus on Monday and Tuesday. The EU on Monday began easing energy and transport sanctions and banking restrictions on Syria in a bid to kickstart Damascus's economy. So while the EU, is seeking to kickstart the economy in Syria, Israel's bombing it. I just want you to have a clear picture of what's happening. Israel has said that they will not tolerate the presence of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham forces in South Syria, and they want the territory to be demilitarized. Just for you to understand, the Syrian state, which was started by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham formed a state military, and then the state, which was HTS, said that HTS should demilitarize, and that the only legitimate, militarized force would be the state force. So HTS, according to Syrian and the Syria state, doesn't exist anymore because HTS became the official state. And so this idea that Israel won't tolerate the presence of Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, are they talking about the president? Or are they talking about the state? Because the U.S. has actually been meeting with the official government officials, which of course al-Shara was the head of the Hayat Tahrir al-Shams. So you're like, what's Israel talking about? The Israeli prime minister demanded the complete demilitarization of Syria, as I just mentioned. We demand the complete demilitarization. He said, likewise, we will not tolerate any threat to the Druze community. The IDF said they hit command centers, weapon depots in South Syria. They also said that they forced attacks on Hezbollah terrorists in the Lebanon Bekaa region, and they cited ceasefire breaches. Arab states were supposed to meet in Saudi Arabia. The Riyadh meeting was considered a first step, and details would be released later. A few updates from the United States. We know the Trump administration released cluster bombs that arrived in Israel a couple of weeks ago. There's been a big question about whether or not those will be used to attack Iran. There's been a question this week of will the United States directly be involved in joining Israel in an attack against Iran? And so that has been a big question. The United States and Israel might decide to attack Iran as early as this fall, according to the former ambassador, Dan Shapiro. But Shapiro said it's highly unlikely that Netanyahu and Trump would face a decision regarding an attack on Iran. Iran raised their alert levels near nuclear sites amid fears of an attack. The Trump administration issued a new round of sanctions against Iran, against 22 individuals and 13 vessels. And on Monday, sanctions on dozens of people, oil tankers across China, the UAE, India, and other jurisdictions over their alleged links to Iran's oil sales. Something else really significant happened this week, which was just like, Trump repealed the directive from Biden that could potentially link U.S. arms sales to human rights. So this was the National Security Memorandum that was under Joe Biden's administration. It was designed to ensure that U.S. military sales were not complicit in human rights violations, and that was repealed by the Trump administration this week. Just a reminder that U.S. Security Memorandum 20, Senator Van Hollen of Maryland was significantly, he played lead alongside of other senators. It was a mechanism for legitimately withholding weapons from Israel because they are being used in violation of international and U.S. law. At the same time, Senator Bernie Sanders introduced a resolution to oppose U.S. arms sales to Israel. He is attempting to block the sale of $8.5 billion of U.S. weapons. He said it would be inconceivable to provide more bombs and weapons to Israel that it has used to kill so many civilians and make life unlivable in Gaza. Late last week, the U.S. President Donald Trump said he would recommend his plan to take over Gaza and displace Palestinians. In other words, he's going to recommend it and not impose it. But he said, I'll tell you, the way to do it is my plan. And I think my plan really works. I'm not forcing it. I'm going to sit back and recommend it. And then the U.S. would own the site. There'd be no Hamas. Then there'd be development. And we'd start all over again with a clean plate. So that seems to be his perspective. Trump's pick for the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, a pastor, he's viewed as very contentious by some in a very, very divided Jewish community. Some of the Zionist Organization of America are very, some are very supportive. It's very polarized in the Jewish community. Rabbi Jonah Dov Pesner, who's the director of the Religious Access Center for Reform Judaism, wrote to 100 senators on behalf of 850 congregations across North America and 1.8 million Reform Jews that the Central Conference of American Rabbis, whose membership includes 2,000 Reform rabbis, in opposition to his appointment. Steve Witkoff is supposed to be in the Middle East this week, as I mentioned already, but he and Jared Kushner discussed bringing together real estate executives to devise a Gaza rebuilding plan. And there was the context for this conversation all around the Trump proposal. The three ideas were that Witkoff and Kushner discussed bringing together development developers and architects to come up with a plan for rebuilding Gaza. Witkoff believes Gaza is unsuitable for living due to unexploded shells and poor conditions, and that the rebuilding effort would cost over $50 billion. He said, we anticipate that soon, as early as next week in the House and Senate, that the possibility of the restoring funding to UNRWA could be presented on Capitol Hill. So that's a possibility. The Restoration Act for UNRWA did come before the last Congress, and its goal was to reverse the pause on U.S. aid to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees. It was introduced in the House by Jepile, Carson, and Schakowsky. In the Senate, it was introduced by Senator Walsh of Vermont. The Trump administration notified at least 1,600 U.S. aid workers that they were fired, and it told most of the staff worldwide that they were on administrative leave this past week. And a federal judge this week upheld that Trump has the right to do so. Just a reminder, Catholic Relief Services, which is an observer of Churches for Middle East Peace, is the largest recipient of U.S. aid. And, so many groups that we work with are so significantly affected by these cuts of foreign assistance, particularly U.S. aid. Students at Columbia, affiliated with Barnard College, held a sit-in protest in response to the expulsion of 2 students who disrupted a history of modern Israel class last month and refused to leave the classroom. So there's been some of those activities, nothing to the degree that we saw last year in terms of the student protests, but we have been hearing about UCLA and some incidents at universities happening. I wanted to just close by reminding you that our advocacy summit is coming up March 19th and 20th. TRUA's director, Rabbi Jill is coming. Also, we've got a lot of speakers. It's very, very late. I don't even know what time it is, but it's late. So, but please join us for our advocacy summit. Jill Jacobs is coming from TRUA, Corey Bush. Munther Isaac is coming to Washington, D.C., launching his new book, Christ in the Rubble, April 1st and 2nd. So please go to our website, sign up for our newsletter. If you didn't see the webinar we did this week on the Holy Land Coordination Committee with Kyle Christophalo and Bishop Chesson and Christopher Lundquist from the USCCB, the Conference of Bishops, I'd really encourage you to take a look. Please, 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 please. Ash Wednesday, we're calling for a snap action with the Gaza ceasefire pilgrimages. Go to Gaza ceasefire pilgrimage singular.org. We're calling people to walk 6.2 miles, the distance from Bethlehem to Jerusalem on Ash Wednesday. And, in the first 12 hours we launched, 37 cities in 9 countries had already signed up to do these snap actions. So calling attention to the atrocities I've been discussing. So may God go before us. Thank you so much for your work, for your efforts. I know people are working tirelessly. You're praying. Your churches are engaged. So do not give up hope. We had an all-day board meeting today, and one of the board members said, the scriptures are clear. Hope is what you do not see. So if you see it, it's not hope. And if you don't see it, that's what hope is. And so I know we don't see it, but hope is on the horizon. So may God go before us in the name of Christ. Amen.